Hi there, I'm Rebekah, and most of you know me as the ghost tour guide of Wilmington, North Carolina. And you'll notice this week's episode is very different, as I am unemployed, like many of you right now. And with this video, I wanted to really take an opportunity to show how things used to be during an epidemic, during a pandemic, specifically how they were here in Wilmington, North Carolina in the 1800s. From there, I want to say thank you so much to all of the people who helped me shoot this. I have been doing all of this within the last 4 days, so that's looking up the history, contacting people, shooting, and actually doing the editing, and I've only been doing editing for about 8 weeks now. So thank you to all of them. This is a passion project of many volunteers who really care and still want to continue their art. I hope you enjoy. High fever, aching neck and shoulders, coughing fits, vomiting, delirium, bleeding, black bile, and yellow skin. If you thought the coronavirus was bad, let me introduce you to yellow fever. Each year in early spring, guests of the historic Oakdale Cemetery may wander the rows of yellow daffodils. These flowers are a stark reminder of an epidemic that would claim nearly a quarter of the residents that remained in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1862. A bustling city and largest in the state at that time, and the lifeline port of the now fallen Confederacy, would suffer to a crippling extent, not from the raging Civil War, but from a truly ruthless enemy. Prior to the events of the epidemic, Wilmington was a bustling port city with no less than 10,000 residents strong. The city was known for its exports of tar, cotton, turpentine, and other cash crops. They were even further connected up and down the east coast of the United States by the longest railroad line in the world at that time. When war broke out, President Lincoln set up a Navy blockade just off the coast of the mouth of the Cape Fear River, where Wilmington sits. He was sure to make this effort within the first year of the war. However, those looking to profit from the blockade runners, were there to continue the trade going in and out of the port. Before and during the war, Wilmington residents regularly welcomed sailors from all over the world. Poor hygiene, unregulated live imports, and questionable water meant that sickness was common. Yellow fever was nothing new to the residents of the Cape Fear region. It had come and gone in years prior, and was already left a residue of fear in its tragedy with older generations. While the area had recovered from the smaller outbreaks in the past, no one in early April of 1862 could have recognized just how treacherous the next few months would be. It was 2 p.m. on April 6, 1862, when a celebrated blockade-running ship came into port. The Kate, as she was known, had come up from Nassau. As with all blockade runners during the Civil War, the journey had been dangerous as ever, and any ship bringing supplies and news from the rest of the world was always celebrated. Rumor had it that those aboard were already sick with the fever. However, the war cutting off major supplies to the region, no quarantine measures were taken. There was no availability for the Kate to stay long in port. The sailors unloaded the cargo only to quickly load up and head back out to sea again. Other things besides pretty clothes came to us from Nassau. Suddenly, a changed atmosphere seemed to envelop everything and everybody. The usual noise and bustle of the streets outside grew strangely hushed. The rumors would temporarily fade, as the citizens were happy enough with the imports to overlook what had been heard and seen. However, the damage had been done, and the sickness was already being carried quietly through the air.
It did not spread at first, was not acknowledged by the physicians, was not even suspected by the masses of the people. An uneasy feeling at length began to prevail. There was a singular increase of certain types of fever, a continually increasing mortality in the physicians' list until at the end of August, people began to inquire into the causes. Still, the idea of yellow fever in Wilmington was ridiculed. Reverend John L. Pritchard of First Baptist Church.
The first of the recognized deaths would occur on September 9th, almost a month after the Kate had arrived. However, due to the war, the once thriving waterway had been eerily silent of the large cargo ships it had regularly once seen. His name was Louis Schwartzman. He was only 36 years old and had worked as a wool and coal dealer right where the Kate had docked, at the foot of Market Street. It was possible that people had died of the fever prior to Schwartzman, but had been misdiagnosed. However, with his death, people could no longer deny the reality. 4 days later, the conclusion of local doctors was clear. Yellow fever was in Wilmington. In order to quell the growing fears that were beginning to spread, town officials did what they could to calm their constituents.
Concerning the yellow fever, only 5 cases have been reported, and we have concluded that there are no signs of it spreading. Wilmington Mayor John Dawson, September 16, 1862.
It says here in the Wilmington Daily News that all excitement will pass away in a few days, and that this by no means approaches the character of an epidemic. And I have a mind to believe them.
They can write what they want. I've seen how many people are sick in the warehouses. Writing my brother in Fayetteville today, we're leaving.
Despite the city putting out notices that the situation was contained, no one had any proof either way. The Kate had been gone a month, and still the fever had continued on. The telltale signs of the severity of the matter was when doctors began to send their families away, many times leaving with them.
There's panic to get away. Citizens and family going in all directions. Everybody who could get away left town. Nicholas Shrink.
I have been in the midst of it without knowing it. Many families are leaving. Reverend John L. Pritchard.
Fears began to spread, and more people continued to be sick. Within only a few weeks' time, Wilmington, as people had known it, would change dramatically. Those of means and wealth were some of the first to leave. Oftentimes, they would leave their employees and slaves behind in their stead to continue their work for them.
The reported appearance of this deadly contagion created a tremendous panic in the city. The citizens were leaving by scores and hundreds in every manner of conveyance that could be obtained. Lemuel Hoyle, a Confederate soldier.
Eventually, people would begin to leave by the droves, losing work if it came to it. Those well enough to leave, to stay with family outside the city, did, and after only a month the population of 10,000 Wilmingtonians dwindled to a mere 4,000.
Now we beg our present and absent citizens to think about this matter a little. Use all proper precautions as wise men, but do not run into panic like children. Do not go unnecessarily into danger, but do not run away foolishly from the mere suspicion of it. James Fulton, The Wilmington Journal.
By late September, Mayor Dawson was no longer able to escape the severity of the situation. He wrote to the mayor of Charleston requesting doctors. Those few doctors who stayed behind were so exhausted with working days without sleep. There were little options left but to call for outside help.
The yellow fever is epidemic here, increasing rapidly, and our physicians are nearly exhausted. Some of them are already sick. Can you send us some experienced assistance for the sake of humanity? Mayor John Dawson, September 24.
Charleston answered with what medical personnel they could provide. However, they too were stretched thin, as many had left to attend the victims of the Civil War.
At the time of our arrival, the alarm and excitement of the population were thoroughly aroused. A large part of the inhabitants had fled from the city to seek refuge in other places, and the fires of rosin and lightwood were burnt in the streets in every portion of the city. Dr. William R. Ragg, Charleston-based physician serving in Wilmington.
The people who were not able to leave started to take to unique measures to protect themselves. It was believed that those working near gasoline were receiving special properties to protect them from the fever. For anyone having to go out, they would soak a cloth in tar and oil, then wear it on their chest in order to inhale the fumes. Others took to burning rosin with their homes to repel the sickness. These efforts would prove fruitless, as the primary carrier of yellow fever would not be discovered until 50 years later: mosquitoes. "1862 was an unusually hot year for the Cape Fear region. Coupled with above-average rainfall meant that mosquitoes were thriving. Wilmington sits on a small hill overlooking the Cape Fear River. While the river flows in and out with the ocean tide daily, this is not to say that there is no other sitting water nearby. The geography of the area is surrounded with swamps, shallow ponds, lazy creeks, and standing water following a storm. Community members would often report flooded cellars and muddy streets. If the water had nowhere to flow quickly due to already high levels of precipitation, mosquitoes carrying the blood of the ill would have a virtually limitless area to breed and lay eggs. The results proved catastrophic. One of the first physicians to raise warnings of the spread of yellow fever was Dr. James Dixon, and he finally succumbed to the illness following the end of September. A week before he died, he was asked why he chose to stay if it was so dangerous.
Well, I reckon you'll have to do as I do. It's like war. We must take our chances. Dr. James Dixon, September 28, 1862.
On the day he was buried, almost a dozen people would be buried alongside him. As more and more people fled, the city was notoriously left in a state of ruin. Supply lines were being cut, and refugees were no longer being allowed within nearby city limits. The closest city of similar size and resources, Fayetteville, put out a notice that anyone attempting to enter would be fined and sent back. Other places took similar measures.
The yellow fever is raging so at Wilmington that some fears are entertained it may spread. Fugitives have already carried it to Fayetteville, and there is one case here in Raleigh. North Carolina Governor Zebulon Vance.
New word from the mayor. All intercourse between the town of Wilmington and Fayetteville be and is hereby suspended. Any refugees have to stay outside the city for at least 48 hours and medically inspected before they come in. Same for any boats coming from down the Cape Fear.
Every hotel quarantined against us, coming from Wilmington. Nicholas shrank.
Those who had stayed were running out of options. Some would find themselves here at what is now recognized as the Burgwin Wright home. The Wright family had been one of the first families to vacate the city when yellow fever was discovered. As the house is one of the largest homes closest to where the initial outbreak occurred, this place became a makeshift hospital for those desperate to leave their families to protect them once sick, or for those who had no family left to care for them. The upper floors turned into a place of care, as it is believed that having the windows wide open would allow clean air for the patients to breathe. However, the opposite occurred, as the wide open, unscreened windows resulted in a free flow of mosquitoes. In September, the city had already begun a service of removing bodies and taking them uphill to be buried.
I recollect well having stood on our home on Market and Fifth Streets, watching wagon loads of corpses go by to Oakdale Cemetery of those who had died of that malignant disease. John D. Bellamy.
Those who remained within the city did what they could to continue removing those who were sick from the town center. However, as more and more began to perish, a wagon a day would prove to not be enough. One of a number of reasons why the Bergwijn house is such a popular location for my ghost tour is that many of the bodies that needed to be removed from upstairs came to sit down in the basement until they could be removed. Sometimes it would take days for dozens of bodies to finally be taken out, and the smell of their decay would permeate the humid air and be the last thing that many people upstairs would smell before they too joined the dead masses. October would prove to be the worst month of the yellow fever epidemic. On the 1st of October, the only remaining telegraph officer would meet their fate. With no one else to work the wires, Wilmington would face being completely sealed off from the rest of the world, as all communication and travel was inaccessible. News of the epidemic would spread across the country, and newspapers began to report to avoid Wilmington at all costs. Those left inside were completely on their own.
Been very sick with yellow fever for several days past. Provisions are very scarce here, and nearly all the stores are shut up. The town looks lonesome, most all the people has left. Bella de Rosset, slave of the de Rosset family, and told to stay behind when the family evacuated.
On average, anywhere from 50 to 60 new cases were diagnosed each day. During the week of October 17th, 431 people would be diagnosed, with 110 dying the following week. Despite the efforts of making Wilmington a quarantine area, by the end of the following month, there would be 14,000 cases in North Carolina and over 1 million cases nationally. Within Wilmington, 1,500 people out of the roughly 4,000 people who remained would contract yellow fever. Of those 1,500, between 650 and 800 would die, a chilling 40%. For those caught up in the mayhem, contraction and death seemed more like a promise than a possibility.
It is a terrible thing to die under such circumstances. I myself feel now much depression. Should I be taken sick and die, I would die too alone. I have no relation or connection here. You cannot imagine the distress and gloom here. Henry M. Drain, Superintendent of the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad.
Death and sickness were abroad and no one else. The streets were deserted, save now and then by a hearse or a physician's buggy, making its weary rounds.
The Confederate Army would be terribly crippled from this primary port city being cut off. During this time, 22 slaves would escape and sail to the sea under the cover of darkness to where Union Navy held a blockade just offshore. They would give the Union critical information of the ins and outs of Wilmington's defenses and topography. They also gave an account of just how weak Wilmington was with the fever, and where the Confederacy had been hiding blockade-running ships, such as the Kate. The Wilmington Armory would be shut down after no one was well enough to man it. The cutoff of supplies to troops, as there were no major weapons manufacturing warehouses, would be catastrophic. One of the largest shipbuilding shipyards in the South would be closed as well. The breaking point would be when the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, nicknamed the Lifeline of the Confederacy, suffered from sick workers, shortages in shipments, and issues with people purchasing the goods as they feared being infected.
The Bible tells us that before the end of the world we will have war, pestilence, and famine. The first two is upon us. The other is fast approaching. Eliza Hill.
Even while times were bleak and fleeing Wilmingtonians were seemingly cut off from the rest of the world, there were efforts to keep those who remained alive. This was a time when every southern city was suffering as they sent their men, food, and supplies to the war. However, even times as they were desperate, cities such as Charleston, Fayetteville, Charlotte, and Richmond took donations of food, clothing, medications, and funds to send down to the port city in whatever ways they could manage. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard would send 4 of his own army surgeons to assist. Once the fever had passed, this would allow citizens to heal faster and continue their efforts for the Confederacy for another 2 years. November 8th would mark Wilmington's first frost of early winter, and with it, the end of disease-carrying mosquitoes for the season. From there, only those who had already been carrying the fever would perish. By November 17th, both the Wilmington Journal and the shipyard were calling for workers to return. They, along with many other businesses, would have to request a tally of those left alive in the city. By November 27th, the devastating yellow fever epidemic was officially declared over. As many did not understand how the fever spread as quickly as it had, many refugees would never return as they feared a resurgence. However, the epidemic of that scale would never again see Wilmington's shore. Yellow fever is still in existence in acts similarly to Ebola and malaria. However, we are fortunate enough to live in the age of modern medicine and an understanding of how germs function.
Humans have a knack for surviving, and that's exactly why I made this video. A lot of people are in a really dark place right now, and even though we're not allowed to physically be together, that doesn't mean that we can't be together in another way. And that's why I'm continuing to make videos. I want to educate people on the reality that things have been worse. On so many different levels, they have been worse. But we as a society have learned from our mistakes, and we have learned to come together to support one another. I know times are hard. I'm entirely unemployed right now, and I don't know where my next check is coming from or how all of my bills are getting paid. But the reality is I can either sit in that feeling or I can try and produce something that will make a larger impact. And that was the point behind this video. So thank you so much for watching from wherever you are. And I hope that you truly take care of yourself and take care of those you love. It always matters.
Ooh.